As a small business owner, my favorite thing about posting a job on LinkedIn is that when I hit post, I clock out and LinkedIn clocks in.
LinkedIn makes it easy to post your job for free, get qualified candidates, and manage them all in one place. Plus, LinkedIn extends the reach of your job post by allowing you to share it with your network. And hiring managers that add a hiring frame to their LinkedIn profiles receive 2 times more qualified applicants. Go to linkedin.com/achieve to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply.
Hey all you heroes, hawks, heralds, crows, pirates, and wardens. Welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast, where we unpack, discuss, and galaxy brain about all the lore behind the Dragon Age series.
We are so excited to bring you this podcast. Every episode, we'll be talking about a different topic in the Dragon Age universe, from character deep dives to exalted marches and elven gods. We will cover it all.
There will be spoilers. And always remember, swooping is bad.
Hello and welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast, where we talk about Dragon Age and its lore. I am one of your hosts, Austin, also known as Teacup.
And I'm your other host, Shelby or She-Cup.
And we're back after our holidays, after it feels like it's been a long time.
It has been a long time. It's been almost a month since we've done an episode. Actually, I think a little bit more than a month because of the holidays. And then we were traveling. And so I didn't want to have us take a break. And so anyway, we're back. We're starting a new season and I'm really excited to dive in.
Yeah. So we are officially done with the books of Dragon Age and all of that. So we're coming back to the lore. And so where are we headed?
So, as you can imagine, with the VEILGUARD's release and all of its lore drops, we're going to talk about the Blight. And we're going to talk about actually a lot of things this season 9. And I just need to give some disclaimers because we're going to be talking about the Blight. We're going to be talking about each of the different blights. We're going to be talking about the old gods. We're going to be talking about darkspawn. So with that, if you've played VEILGUARD, you know that there's a lot of new lore we're going to be covering. And we will be talking about a lot of these revelations in depth. So if you haven't at least gotten into Act 2 of the VEILGUARD, I would recommend not listening to this episode especially, and really not listening to much of this season outside of patron chats and character deep dives. We are going to do our absolute best to kind of stick to the format that we established earlier in the fall with, we're going to talk about major lore developments from VEILGUARD after the mid-break, but there are just some times when that's not going to be possible. So this is your spoiler alert, spoiler warning. For just this whole entire season, there are going to be spoilers. So please don't. We're telling you now so that you don't comment and leave us reviews about it.
Right. And even if you have made it into Act 2 of the VEILGUARD, if you have not finished the Regrets of the Dread Wolf quest, you probably need to be wary of spoilers because spoilers ahead.
So, okay, I have another disclaimer before we get started. So this episode specifically, I just want to give a little bit of a background to, because we're going to be talking about the Blight in general. So a lowercase b, not necessarily the first Blight or the second Blight. And, so we're talking about the disease, the corruption, not the cataclysmic event. We will cover the events of the first, second, third Blight, and so on and so forth eventually throughout this season. But today we are going to be talking about the force of corruption that is associated with the darkspawn rather than those events.
Right. Yeah. So I guess that's a big difference. Like, because I never really thought about it until we gave this disclaimer. But these terms are used interchangeably. Like, you have the blight, or it is a blight.
Yeah, they are,
and they're very different things.
Yes, I mean they go together. The blight corruption is part of a blight, but I mean, I think a more accurate word to describe the corruption of the darkspawn is the taint, which I know we find hilarious. And so this just kind of dives into my first fun fact. So I'm just going to move right along. So my first fun fact is that the word taint, while hilarious, actually predates the chantry. And I find that absolutely hysterical. According to a letter that we have that's dated 1004 to Venter or minus 191 ancient, that's where we get that from. So prior to the chantry establishing its religious beliefs about the darkspawn and the taint and all of that, the word taint was being used in Thedas.
Yeah, and that's common with religions of some time, is that they will speak about certain things to describe phenomenon that they see in the world around them. But I don't want to get too much into, like, is the chantry just wrong? But
yeah, that's not on topic. So get out with that. But I mean, we all make jokes about the word taint all the time. So we're probably going to do that in this episode too. But my second fun fact is that most of Thedas prior to the VEILGUARD has only seen the Blight's power via the darkspawn taint. But as we learn in that game, in the beginning of that game, this is only a fragment of the Blight's power, which is frightening. And we'll talk about that more later. So, okay, I do want to start by talking about the taint, which, again, while funny, is more accurate and more specific term than blight. The taint is primarily used by the wardens, as we know, to create wardens. But it refers generally to the corruption that is carried by the darkspawn and infects other creatures, people, and even things. It manifests as spidery tendrils and or black rot, and can actually be transmitted through contact with darkspawn blood and or fluids. So like spit, all of that kind of stuff, as well as through objects that have been imbued with it. Contact with a darkspawn does not necessarily automatically infect you, but it does increase your chances of it significantly.
It's when it was like blood and fluids, and I was like, oh, so it's Thedas' STD.
I mean, kind of. I don't think that's too far off, truthfully.
Right. So this is a little not safe for work comment, but if you have sex with a warden, can you then get the taint?
I don't know, and I don't want to think about it.
All those making me rethink a lot of my decisions I've made.
Yeah, seriously. So, okay, anyway, moving right along from that. The VEILGUARD confirmed a lot of theories we've had about the darkspawn, the blight, and the taint, which, like I said, we'll discuss. But the idea that the taint is magical in nature actually is not a new concept. A lot of people think that's a new concept from VEILGUARD. That's not new at all, because it actually goes back to Dragon Age 2, if not even earlier.
And I think even without discussing some of the things in the VEILGUARD, like, I've always assumed that the Blight Taint is magical because it comes from the Fade. Like, at least in the lore before VEILGUARD and all of that, like, the Chantry teaches us that the Magisters breached the Fade and unleashed the Blight upon the world. Like, so it's always been connected to the Fade, and so much so that a Dwarven Grey Warden will have dreams.
Right, and, you know, I do think that one of the reasons why people doubted the veracity of the taint being magical or not is because they also doubted whether or not the Magisters actually did breach the Fade, and that's how the Darkspawn and the taint got to Thedas in the first place.
I don't think there's any debate of that now. Like, they went. They did it. Like, Corypheus is enough for me of, like, no, they breached the fade and something happened.
Yeah, I mean, Corypheus also was enough for me, but with the VEILGUARD, I mean, it does definitely confirm that, at least in part, the Chantry was right about one thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, let's talk about Grey Wardens just a little bit. So, they use the taint by ingesting darkspawn blood and archdemon blood via the joining. What is so funny?
I'm just thinking about, because, okay, so in the show notes, there was a typo of, instead of blood, she put band. And so now I'm just imagining a group of darkspawn musicians that attend joining ceremonies and just play kick-ass songs.
Okay. Anyway, so we know the joining happens. Those that survive become Grey Wardens, blah, 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 blah. Developing a connection to the darkspawn, which allows them to sense the darkspawn and fight them more effectively. We know all this. This is old lore. However, they do eventually succumb to the taint. As we also know, old lore becoming more and more like ghouls over time. So it is important to establish that. I think most of us know that is how it happens, but just FYI for those of you who don't.
So I do have a little thought, but I wanted to preface this that this is a major spoiler for Davrin's companion quest. So if you haven't done that or not, you might want to skip ahead a little bit. But this is your spoiler warning. For that, I want to talk about this. Theoretically, if we take what happens with the Griffins and Isaiah in the VEILGUARD, the taint can theoretically prolong their lifespan.
Right. Absolutely. Like, it doesn't automatically kill you, although it's very, very, very unlikely for you to last it as long as Isaiah has.
Mm-hmm. I mean, she's our only example.
I mean, yes.
Other than the Magisters. Corypheus and the Architect.
The Corypheus has been imprisoned.
Right.
That's how he survived so long.
But he is not, like, but they, as Varric says, they killed him, not like we think we killed him, like full of stab wounds and arrows killed him. But Corypheus can move through any blighted creature to regenerate himself, similar to an archdemon.
Yes, okay, I get what you're saying now, but Corypheus was in the prison for hundreds of years versus, okay, a couple years just floating around after after two before Inquisition, however long it was. So let's talk about the origin of the Blight for a little bit. And this is where I am going to throw up the spoiler warning again, because from here on out, like, heavy spoilers for VEILGUARD. But according to Solas's memories for the origin of the Blight, it was formed when he sundered the Titans from their spirits via the Lyrium dagger, which is then what separated their dreams from their bodies. And as we know also from the memories, this left them mindless and broken at worst, and the severed dreams of the Titans were then driven mad, transforming into what Solas himself describes as, quote, a disembodied blight of pain and anger, end quote. He then locked the Blight in a location protected by wards. I assume this location was the Golden City / the Black City. However, the other Evanuris wanted to use this power during their wars, during their civil war, and when Mythal tried to stop them, they murdered her. This is what led Solas to create the veil to seal away both the Blight and the Evanuris.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting because, like, we always knew that the Evanuris, I feel like, were not going to be good people. Like, I think, like, when we were going into, based on how Trespasser and all of Inquisition ends, we knew that, like, hey, the Evanuris are not going to be like, oh, they're just happy-go-lucky gods of elven people.
Yeah, and I mean, even, like, going back to the older lore from Origins, like, a lot of their legends do not depict them as these, like, all-knowing, all-good, benevolent gods. Like, that most of them, I think Mythal is the major exclusion here, and maybe Siles and June too, they've never been depicted as all good. Like, look at how Elgernon is depicted. Like, I mean, like, they straight up acknowledge, like, yeah, this guy's kind of evil.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think the one thing that this was, like, kind of a twist, I wasn't really surprised, but I kind of more expected, like, the like you were slave owners and that kind of dictator, not the you took what this destructive force and tried to use it. And basically it almost feels like the Evanuris, well, we know this, but like we're almost like scientists who had gone mad with their own like discovery and experimentation.
Yeah, I mean definitely Gillenan for sure, Gillenane for sure. Yeah, we can talk a lot more about the Evanuris, and we will also in future episodes, but I do want to talk about the Tevinter Magisters for a little bit, because many years after Solus locks them all away, the Tevinter Magisters, they did breach the Black City, or the Golden City at first, which is what turned it into the Black City, and they did succeed in releasing a fragment of the Blight, a fragment, which then grew and grew and grew and grew, leading to the Blights, the cataclysmic events that ravaged Thedas over the centuries. And this is actually what the Chantry teaches as the cause of the Blight, and in a way is correct. I mean, no, it's not the cause of the Blight coming into existence. Solus did that when he severed the Titans' dreams from their bodies, but the Magisters, the Tevinter Magisters breaching the Black City are what is the cause of the Blight existing in Thedas. So in a way, yes, the Chantry is correct. Yes, in a way, the Chantry is particularly the most correct in terms of inside of Thedas what they believe about how the Blight came to be, which I find hilarious, because basically the whole game of VEILGUARD is, hey, the Chantry was wrong about everything.
Right. And I don't think that, like, I think as a fandom we really have to understand and separate the Chantry from the Maker in a lot of ways. Like, just because the Chantry has gotten it wrong, and speaking as a Christian, like, there are many things that have been interpreted incorrectly that we have later discovered of, oh, this really isn't how this was meant. Like, a great example is we shortened a old proverb, not in the book of Proverbs, but just Proverbs, of blood of the covenant is thicker than water in the womb. And we shortened that to blood is thicker than water. Well, the phrase means exactly the opposite of what we use it for today. Like, This happens all the time, but it doesn't negate the existence of the Maker. And I don't even think it negates, like, Andraste and the visions that Andraste had. And there's a lot that we can unpack, but if you're curious about why I don't think VEILGUARD disproves the Maker, you can hop into our Discord and I'll gladly talk about it with you.
Yeah, well, I mean, it doesn't disprove the Maker because it doesn't mention the Maker at all, really. I think, and I mean, I don't want to get too deep into this, but the reality is that every religion in Thedas has been wrong. I mean, look at the Dalish elves and their reverence for the Evanuris. I mean, there's no way the Chantry is more wrong than them.
Right. Which, like, is a good point. And, like, I think that really what with this, the Blight and the Taint, and understanding that, I want to move on after this, but, like, understanding, like, the regret that Solus has, like, this is one of the early regret things that he's like, no, like, this was wrong. Is what leads to the Blight. And I think that, like, there's a lesson in this of that when you intentionally inflict pain on another person or do something that is, like, harmful or directly harming that person, it leads to far-reaching consequences beyond just hurting that person. And I think that's a lesson that we can take from the VEILGUARD overall.
That is a lesson Solus has yet to learn. Exactly. Which is unfortunate. But let's move on a little bit, because I do have one more point about the Magisters and the Chantry. So the Magisters' entrance into the Black/the Golden City is viewed by the Chantry as the second sin, and the Maker sent the Blight as punishment. So we know that that's not necessarily true, but also, interestingly, Corypheus totally rejects this theory, and he claims that they did not bring darkness into the world, but rather they simply discovered it, which is interesting to me because also Corypheus is right. Like, they didn't create the Blight. They just discovered what was already there from the Evanuris, from Solus, and they did. They just brought it to Thedas.
And, like, Corypheus and the other magisters were played. Like, they were manipulated. They were played. I mean, I'm not arguing that they were good people because they were Tevinter magisters who enslaved people and ruled with iron fist and were very easily swayed by the lure of power.
Right.
But they were tricked into doing this.
Yeah, I mean, the Avenurus whispered to them from the Fade and convinced them to breach the Golden City. And so that's what happened. So it is entirely their fault because they allowed themselves to be manipulated, and maybe that's not the right word. It is their fault because they chose to go to the Golden City, but also I wouldn't give them full culpability on it because, again, they were manipulated. So I do want to move on a little bit to just some traditional thoughts that, most commoners have throughout Thedas. And they just generally believe that blights occur when darkspawn find and corrupt one of the Tevinter old gods, which is then transformed into an archdemon by the darkspawn's taint, and then they lead the horde to attack the surface. This isn't totally incorrect, but the VEILGUARD does establish that the imprisoned Avenurus spoke through their dragon thralls, which were the old gods. Thus, they were able to manipulate the original magisters into breaching the Golden City, which is what we just talked about. So, they are the old gods, but they're also the dragon thralls of the Avenurus.
Mm-hmm. This is probably a question you don't have an answer to, but I'm going to ask it anyway. How do they know which dragon is which? Like the Grey Wardens, like they're always like, oh, the first blight was Dumont, and this was this god, and then we have Lusicon and Razikel in the VEILGUARD.
I don't know exactly, but they do know which. I should say some of the wardens, like the higher ranking wardens, know some of which which dragons and which old gods were imprisoned where. So they know some, like if it awakens over this area, they know it's got to be this one. But there is lore that basically says like no one person in the wardens knows where every single one was. So great question. I don't really know the answer.
All right.
Well, I think now would be a good time to go to our mid-break.
All right.
Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike big wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
I went to Kirkwall once. Yeah? Bit of a shithole. Yeah.
Well, tell me, have you ever licked a lamppost in winter?
What do you think Rook's like in person? Do you think they smell nice?
What is wrong with you? And have you forgotten which side you're on?
No. I mean, think about if we could turn them. Riding beside Rook at the head of Tevinter's vast armies. I could stab them for you, on the house.
All right. Welcome to the middle of the show where we take time to talk about all things going on with the podcast that's not about the lore of Dragon Age. And so I say thank you to our patrons. Thank you to our first patrons, Genesis and Lisa M. We also have some new patrons to shout out. Abel S., David, Elvinco, and Dale G. Welcome. So glad. Thank you for supporting us on Patreon. And a special welcome back to the Nug King Lewis H., who will get a thank you at the mid-break and the end of every show that we have. And so if you want to support us on Patreon, you can do so at patreon.com/DALorecast. If you can't support us, another great way is to leave us ratings and reviews on Apple or Spotify. If you leave us 5 stars and a kind review and a kind comment, we will read it out on a future episode of the show. And so I have a comment from our Tevinter Nights Part 3. This is from Eli NG20. And says, great commentary and analysis as always. Eight Little Talons was my absolute favorite chapter in the book, and I think it's also worth mentioning that it was obviously heavily inspired by And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. Even the title is a reference. Keep up the amazing work, guys. Thank you so much for that comment. We are so glad that you enjoyed that episode. Eight Little Talons was also my favorite chapter of that book as well. And then lastly, if you're new here, if you're coming in because you played the VEILGUARD and you're like, I want a Dragon Age podcast, we're so excited you're listening to the show. Join us on Discord. That is where we talk about all our crazy crackpot theories and all things like that. And so you can find that link in the episode description, the Cups Podcasting and More Discord. And with that, that's all I have for the middle of the show.
Don't Templars have anything better to do than come up with new ways to torment mages?
No. Again, I'm so sorry Manfred keeps wandering in while you're asleep, Lucanus.
I think he wonders about spite.
Curiosity has feet.
We have enough feet already.
It has feet.
You fear barbarians will swoop down upon you.
Yes, swooping is bad.
All right, so let's get back into the lore. And I do want to start off this second half just by talking about and breaking down everything we know from VEILGUARD that hasn't already been discussed. So the events of the VEILGUARD are actually technically categorized as the 6th Blight. So all of you double Blight crack theory shippers out there, I have to give you a pause because you were technically right. You're very correct. But we also just learned so much about the Blight and its power in general. And we have already discussed some of the revelations about its origins. So I want to dive into its power and really how it changed in VEILGUARD. So first off, we know that Gillenane was a master at using the power of the Blight to create horrible monsters. And she really, out of all of the Evanuris, is the one that used it the most, as far as we know so far. And she very much saw the Blight as raw potential and a tool of creation rather than a force of destruction. We learn in a quest called The Labs Below that she is responsible for the creation of the darkspawn. Gillenane herself created the darkspawn. And that's why we see so many new kinds of darkspawn coming up in the VEILGUARD, because she created them and she made them quote unquote better, more powerful, more frightening to us. So she alone was uniquely capable of molding the power of the Blight into life, which is what really earned her spot in the Evanuris. And so she is uniquely alone in this power. I don't believe any of the other Evanuris really were able to use the Blight in this way. Some of them probably didn't want to. So Gillenane is really the one that is diving deep there. And so after being released from her prison, of course, she saw the fragment of the Blight that was released centuries earlier had actually altered the darkspawn and her creatures. And so she felt that the current darkspawn, as we know them in the Dragon Age, were unworthy of her. And so she set out to improve the darkspawn. That's another reason why there are so many new and unfamiliar types of darkspawn in the VEILGUARD. And, she also very much worked to change the Blight, creating Blight bubbles and Blight pools that spawn darkspawn and all of these kinds of things, these new ways that we haven't seen the Blight manifest yet, is because she is there to create new things out of it and shape it in different ways, whereas previously she had been imprisoned and was no longer able to do that.
But I have so many questions about brood mothers in regards to this lore. Like, were brood mothers of Gillenane's original design? Is that something the Blight just kind of created in Gillenane's absence? I have so many questions.
I don't think you'll ever get the answer.
No, and I think part of this is also that BioWare as a whole wanted to move away from the very problematic lore surrounding brood mothers.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. I'm fine with that decision. But as always, I would like an answer to the questions. But I do want to talk about a codex entry, which is called an improved Blight. And again, it's from VEILGUARD. And this is what it says. I'm just going to read the whole thing because it's very fascinating. The Blight was active during our slumber. It can alter living creatures, but its shapes are crude, wasteful. Elgernon has requested vassals worthy of a god. Thickening the darkspawn's bones and quickening their ichor was trivial. Other alterations are underway. Pools of Blight are easily coaxed to produce darkspawn repeatedly. Some of their properties change without prompting. Their flesh is surprisingly malleable, vital, eager. It used to require greater effort to shape the Blight. Did we accumulate more of it in ourselves as we slept? Investigate later. Note from Bellara. Is this Gillenane? Does she not know what she looks like? Or did she graft on extra bits before getting blighted? I don't know which is worse. End quote.
It's so interesting to me because, like, I think I'm curious to know, like, what kind of magical powers did the Evaneris have before they kind of just had the Blight and all of that? Because I think the myth of Gillenane creating the Hala is true. I think there's a codex entry that we can find that Gillenane is still like, the Hala are still my, like, beloved creation.
Yeah.
And, like, the Hala are beautiful and they're majestic and they're graceful and doing all of that. But everything about the Blight is monstrous.
Yeah, but I also think if you look at Gillenane, if you look at her appearance, you could see the echoes of that grace. You can see how, like, the lines of her model, her headpiece, like, you can see how there is grace and beauty in that. It's just also monstrous because it's blighted. And you don't usually hear the term blighted and graceful in the same sentence, but I do think that that's part of Gillenane's whole identity, is the juxtaposition between the beauty of creation and the monstrosity of the Blight.
And I think the Blight, as we've, like, I would say, like, VEILGUARD didn't change the lore of the Blight. I would just say expanded the lore of the Blight, because most of the, like, pieces of what we had from the original games, as we've kind of discussed, are still there. Like, they're just changed, and I would say expanded is probably a good word for what VEILGUARD did to the Blight lore.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that they also confirmed a lot of fan theories that have always been floating out there. And that's more about the old gods, too, than the Blight necessarily. But with Tevinter Nights especially, and the Horror of Hormak chapter, it's just kind of like, I saw this coming. This is not a surprise to me. This is not a surprise to most people who have stayed active in the fandom and kind of read the materials that were coming out in the 10-year wait. To those of you who haven't played Dragon Age since Inquisition came out, I can see how it would be a little bit more startling and confusing even. But I don't necessarily think that it is that big of a deviation from the lore. I think you're right. It's more of just like an expansion on some bits and pieces that were already in there, some hints that were already in the codex, and an expansion of its origins. Because, like, everything else with, like, okay, it being on the surface and how a Blight actually works, like, none of that is new information.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think you have one more point, so I'll kind of get some final thoughts after your last point, and then we can move on to our side character.
Yeah, so my last point is basically just that, you know, while Elgernon and Gillenane use the Blight as a weapon and a tool of creation respectively, it is not without consequences that they do so. They, too, become affected and corrupted by the Blight, hence Gillenane's appearance. Elgernon, I think there is a codex entry, or maybe, I don't remember exactly what, but, like, there is lore that he is using magic to make himself appear as he once did. And, like, his hair is not hair. He's bald like Solus. He's got hair on his little crown thingy. So they are being corrupted by the influence of the Blight. It's just a little bit more prevalent and obvious in Gillenane's case, which also, you know, I think she uses the Blight more intimately than Elgranon does. So that could be a reason as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Overall, I think like the Blight itself, and I think its relation to, I want to talk about the Maker, even though the VEILGUARD doesn't talk about the Maker. The Blight is a perversion of creation. Like when we really talk about it, like what it's used for is a perversion of creation, which if we take the Chant of Light and kind of the lessons that they teach that the Maker's first children, the spirits, aka the original, like the spirits who then took bodies and became the Evanuris, they disappointed the Maker because they didn't have any true creative power. And the Maker was disappointed in them, and thus the Maker created humanity. And so it's interesting to me, this kind of like throwback of like showing us like the Blight's creative powers, but like its perversion of a created powers, that you could take that and almost apply it to be like, this almost is more egregious and more understanding if the Maker would turn his back on spirits, if the reason is because of what the Evanuris did. And then you have a more just and a more righteous Maker, in my opinion, if that is the truth.
I totally agree with that. And I think also we see this perversion of creation with the way the darkspawn behave, because they don't create, they don't build cities, they don't have a civilization. What they do is tear down Thedas' civilization, tear down the dwarven civilization. So they are a force of destruction rather than creation.
Right. And I think the only way we see the darkspawn create any kind of sentience is with the guiding hand of one of the original Tevinter Magisters or someone like Isaiah, where there is a sense of someone who was originally human or immortal.
Yeah, and I mean, I also think, I mean, I'm like, I kind of agree with that, and I kind of don't, just because, like, the archdemons do command, and the archdemons get emissaries who command the horde, but that honestly is more of like a militaristic chain of command rather than actual sentience. So I do both agree with you and disagree a little bit, but generally, yeah, I think you are correct in that.
And then my last thing is, I'm really curious to see, like, I don't necessarily think like the Blight is over and done with, like when I'm talking like the Blight, the lowercase Blight that we're talking about, because especially with Antoine and Evka, we learn that the Blight is adapting and changing. And like this is the big tension with the First Warden and the rest of the Grey Wardens, because the First Warden is very much like, no, the Blight is predictable. We have to fight it like we always had. And Antoine, if you're a Warden Rook, and Evka are like, no, like this is changing. This is different. This is something else.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the question remains if whether or not Gillenane is coordinating those changes, or if the Blight is doing it of its own accord. But I know regardless of that, there are no more archdemons left. So the archdemons are donezo, goodbye. But that does not mean the effects of the corruption and just the corruption itself are not still everywhere throughout Thedas. And we know that at the end of VEILGUARD, it is everywhere throughout Thedas. So this is going to be a long cleanup. And we know, you know how insidious the Blight corruption is if you've played any of these games.
Right. But, and like, it's important to know that the Blight existed long before not long before, but before the Evanuris created their Dragon Balls.
True. That is true. So do you have more thoughts, or are we ready to get into our side character?
I think I'm ready to get in the side character.
Okay, so today we're back with side characters after a very long time without them. I'm actually really excited because I didn't realize how much I loved this segment of our show, but it just really gives us a chance to dive into some of these like random characters who are side characters who are not super important to the lore, but who don't have enough information for a full character deep dive. So I'm excited to get back into these. And today's is one you may not have heard of, but who actually does have a pretty important role is in Thedas. And this is Carinus, the founder of the Grey Wardens. Now, most of this information does come from the tabletop RPG, so its canon status is a little bit iffy, but I'm just going with it. So Carinus was a leader of a band of soldiers and knights, primarily from the Anderfels and some from across Tevinter. At first, when they're first rising up and coming into leadership, regular Thedosians had not connected the taint and the blight corruption spreading across the land with the rise of the darkspawn horde. So like this is back in the days of the first blight. People were still learning about it, and they didn't have all the answers that they have in the Dragon Age. But Carinus's group was growing increasingly certain that yes, the horde and the corruption were connected. So in -305 Ancient, his group gathered at Weishaupt, where they renounced all other allegiances to their countries, to their lords, to their leaders, and thus formed the Order of the Grey Wardens. They believed that purging the land of darkspawn would also reverse the physical effects of the blight on the land. Ultimately, Carinus and his company would fight Dumat, discover the joining ritual, and become instrumental in preserving a future for Thedas. However, the stories of Carinus and his travels to recruit allies may be a part of Warden lore, but most scholars in Thedas regard them as little more than folk tales. In fact, few scholars even acknowledge his existence at all.
Interesting. I find this so interesting, and the part of this that kind of stuck out to me is the belief that purging the darkspawn would also reverse the physical effects of the blight on the land, which the VEILGUARD kind of confirms a little bit with the quest in the Hosberg wetlands.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I don't necessarily think that wasn't confirmed in other games. I absolutely think that that's just like kind of a no-brainer. Like when the horde is no longer ravaging the lands, like the lands do heal. It just takes a really long time. I think it takes longer than Carinus and his order would have predicted.
Well, and I think that it is worth noting that we walk all around Redcliffe and the hinterlands in Inquisition, and the horde marched through there, destroyed Lothering and all of that. And so, but we don't really see any evidence of the blight in the hinterlands. And that just might be a game design thing rather than a lore thing. But
that's true. But also there are definitely examples in Thedas that the land has been changed by the horde and by the blights. Like I think about in the Western Approach, actually just the Western Approach in general, it's a desert because of the blight. And there's that big canyon, that like ravine, the breakage in the rock. That's where either the archdemon or the horde first emerged from. And it's never healed. It's never gone back to being a verdant green area. And I don't think it ever will. So I think the different blights have affected the land differently. And at least with the 5th blight, I'm hesitant, and the 6th blight, but especially the 5th blight, I'm hesitant to apply anything that happens in it and say, oh, this is typical for all blights, because it was so short.
Right. I was just thinking about that. And maybe because just in general, the blights got more frequent because the prison holding the Avenuris was weakening.
That's also true too. But I mean, the older, the 1st and 2nd blights were the worst because they lasted so much longer because they didn't know how to deal with them.
Right.
So that's going to affect the land worse than ones that only last for a few years.
And I think like this is worth noting, especially after reading Last Flight, the Orlesian wardens and the wardens at Weishaupt were aware of the 5th blight going on. There was just political things that were keeping them from coming in to Ferelden. And so they were basically like, okay, if Ferelden wants to be off on their own, we'll let them, and we'll be shoring up our defenses and plan. Like, even if the Hero Ferelden hadn't stopped the Blight, I don't think the 5th Blight would have been very long, because I think that the Orlesian and Anderfell's wardens would have been ready to strike.
Yeah, well, we know that the Orlesian wardens were amassing and gathering in Jader, which is, I think, the closest Orlesian city to Ferelden in the first place during the 5th Blight. And we also know, I know this because I just did research for this side character, we know that Clarel really wanted to help in the 5th Blight and was prohibited by Loghain. And so they were trying. It's not like they just didn't give a shit. Loghain did not allow any other. I mean, Loghain tried to get rid of any warden in Ferelden and did succeed in some cases. So,
right, that's true. But yeah, I think it's so interesting, this founder of the warden, and like we don't really know who killed Dumont.
Right,
like,
we don't.
Like, was it him? Was it
I don't know.
one of these other how many Grey I want to know how long after the founding of the Grey Wardens did it take for them to take down Dumont?
Well, I mean, the first Blight lasts for over 100 years, I'm pretty sure. So, that's generations. But I haven't actually dug into that research yet, so I don't know if we know how many times they tried to kill Dumont. It had to be at least twice, because they had to find out in some way that, okay, a Grey Warden has to be the one to kill him.
We have to figure out something because he's not dying.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's all
that's all I've got.
All right. Well, thank you for all this research. It was very fascinating. I think this is going to be a really, really great season, and I'm super excited for more. Thank you all for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. We will see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. You can find us on Twitter at DA Lorecast.
If you have any lore questions, topics to unpack, or side character suggestions, join our Cups Podcasting and More Discord server. It's easily the best place on the internet. You can also support us financially through our Patreon. You can find us there on patreon.com/DragonAgeLorecast.
The Dragon Age Lorecast is part of the Robots Radio Network. For more information about the Robots Radio Network, join the Discord server via the link in our episode description.
If you enjoyed the show or learned something new today, please subscribe, leave us a review, and join the Patreon. And if you enjoyed our intro and outro music, give a big thank you to Pipeman Studios. Thank you, Pipeman. Thanks again for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. We'll see you next time.
How well do you know your video game lovers?
Have you ever wondered how your video game bays stack up against all the other delectable digital dates?
I'm Genesis, the girl whose motto in life is love, laugh, tequila. And on Two Girls, One Ship, we analyze, rate, and review all that the world of video game romances has to offer.
And I'm Vervada, the hopeless romantic cat lady and lifelong gamer.
But you should know that our podcast centers on character and romance analysis and doesn't shy away from exploring the fun of physical connection.
Or from the deep emotional connections built between two characters, using specific in-game dialogue and the overall narrative journey. So join the Two Girls, One Ship shipsters, and remember,
beauty is in the eye of the controller.